Well, good morning again, everyone. We're glad that you've joined us on our live Facebook page, and we hope and pray that you're enduring these unprecedented days of being separated from each other, maybe from not only family and friends, but maybe even most importantly, our church body. And I'm really missing the corporate church gatherings, both the small and the large gatherings. Social distancing just, goes against my nature. And but I plan on following the guidelines for the good of the whole, and trust that you will as well. So today we're in our second week of a series that I'm calling The Day That Changed Everything, and it's all about explaining Easter. And last week we talked about the meaning of Easter, and I'm going to review that just for a moment here. And it's also traditionally called Palm Sunday, as we've mentioned already. And I just want to say, the communion devotion by Matt and the thoughts that we have that we need to stay focused. And I hope today with the message keeps us focused on the importance of this particular time of the year when we remember specifically Jesus' resurrection. But today is traditionally called Palm Sunday, the week before Jesus triumphed over the grave with his bodily resurrection. Palm Sunday is the day that Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem in a triumphal fashion, as we read there earlier and together. Last week, we looked at the meaning of Easter and the significance of Jesus' resurrection. Last week, we saw how the Apostle Paul explained the connection of Jesus' resurrection with our own resurrection someday. And he made three specific and significant statements to convince the Corinthians to have faith and how they should look forward to their own resurrection. He said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14, "If Christ has not been raised, your preaching is useless, and so is your faith." And then in verse 17 of the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, he said, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, you are still in your sins." And then thirdly, he said, "If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are to be pitied more than all men." In verse 19 there. So Paul made it crystal clear, because of Jesus' resurrection as the first fruit, we could look forward to our own resurrection. It is foundational to our faith. It is where we stand. Jesus' resurrection was a real game changer, as we said last week. And so this morning, we're going to look back at the events of the last 21 hours of Jesus' life here on earth. And for a short time, as we look over this, it almost appears that God's plan for redeeming man is going to be thwarted, and kind of a setback, if you will. And we're going to see, though, how all of these events were all a part, though, of God's plan. Have you ever noticed, and I'm thinking locally here, the walls in the lobby at Sparrow Hospital, or maybe some other hospital that you have visited, the pictures of some of the doctors and some of the cases, even in some cases, even staff members that have served there in those hospitals over the years. And those portraits, they're there as reminders of those who gave their lifeblood to this idea of caring for the sick, of all loving on people while they were sick. And I'm thinking this morning, because I actually have a couple friends that have contacted the coronavirus, and several actually, and so I'm thinking of first responders. I'm thinking of those that are in the medical field that are giving of their lives, almost putting it at risk in a high way. And so I just am thinking about that. I'm glad we prayed for them, but as I thought about those pictures on the walls of hospitals, I've actually been to a hospital where those pictures were, and then one time I went visiting at the hospital, and all of a sudden those pictures were gone. And maybe the hospital just moved them to another area of the hospital, but they were gone. And that saddened my spirit because Jesus knew that we would need a reminder that he died for us. And without that steady reminder, his act on the cross might, lose a place in our mind and consequently in our heart. And so the night before he died, while he and his best friends ate dinner, he used some of the items on the menu to serve as reminders. You know them. When we eat together and break bread, he said, think of my body that will be punished for you. Or, and when you drink the wine, the fruit of the vine, think of my blood that will come from my body while I die. And as best as we can historically tell, the followers of Jesus began a regular practice of using their dinner time as to remember the work that Jesus did on the cross. And it appears they made sure that they did this every week as they came together as a church family and worshiped. And there are indications that some may have done it every day in their homes. And now, some 2,000 years later, churches all over the world, just like ours, take a few moments in their worship services and use those items to remember what Jesus did on the cross, our communion time, the Lord's Supper, meeting with the Lord around his table, and the emblems that remind us of his body and blood and what he did for us. It's as if Jesus was saying the night before he died, I don't ever want you to forget what will happen in the next few hours. I don't ever want you to take the portraits, if you will, off of the wall of your mind. He wants us to keep that picture in our mind. And so because of all that, I think it's a good thing a good practice around Easter time to walk through a reminder of what happened specifically on Good Friday. And so this morning, I'd like to describe the events of about the last 21 hours of Jesus' life here on earth. And our timetable is only an estimate because they didn't keep time like we do today. For instance, sunrise and sunsets weighed in heavily on how they counted days. And there are enough hints in Scripture, though, that give us a general idea. And so the 21 hours come in 4 specific segments in the Bible. And I'm going to use our way of referring to time to help us understand it better. For instance, Thursday night, from 6 p.m. to midnight when Jesus was in the upper room with his disciples, and then after that went into the Garden of Gethsemane. On Friday, turning from Thursday night into Friday midnight to 3 a.m. was his actual arrest. And then Friday morning, from 3 in the morning until 9 a.m., there were those trials that he went through, and we'll share about that. And then on Friday afternoon, or Friday morning, from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m., we have the story told of their crucifixion. Now, before I dive into all that, I think I need to make an important note here. The material that we use to know what happened during those time frames is found in the 4 books of the Bible called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are the Gospels. These 4 men wrote about Jesus' life and kind of gave a biography about his life and from his birth to his ascension back into heaven. And so there's a lot of material there, but about a third of it deals with the final week of Jesus' life and the time he spent here after his resurrection. And then if you took that 1/3 of material, you would see that the majority of that is even about the day of Friday, about Friday and the day that he died. And it's almost like the authors are saying, hey, make sure that you don't forget the last week. And definitely make sure that you don't forget Friday. And so with all that in mind, we're going to take a glance at what happened in these time segments and take notice of some particular things of interest. So let's look at the first period, the first segment, Thursday night from 6 p.m. until midnight. It's in the upper room and Jesus going to the Garden of Gethsemane. In each of these four segments, there are more things than happen than we have time to share and look over in their entirety. But so I want to just pick out a thing or two that happened to Jesus during the time segments, which will help us understand what he went through. And what I want to mention in this first section is something that I've actually seen in my grandchildren, and you've probably seen it in your children or grandchildren as well. And what that is when they are leaving infancy or toddlerhood, their emotions are magnified either for the positive or the negative based on the people they recognize being near them. You know what I mean. Shake your head. Okay? Well, you can't do that today, but I hope you're shaking your head where you're at right now. And if a parent or grandparent or maybe an aunt or uncle, makes that big fuss over the baby or the infant or the toddler, gets them giggling and then all of a sudden just leaves them and walks away, their little emotions can come crashing down. And you've seen it before. All of a sudden that bottom lip, kind of sticks out there and comes out and starts to quiver, starts to pucker, and they can't believe that these great loving kinfolk of theirs have suddenly just left them, got them all excited, and then leave. And you know what happens next. Next, they burst out in tears and they start crying. And then you know what happens next, though. As soon as mom or dad picks them up, their whole face lights up with the biggest toothless smile you've ever seen. And so they learn early, they learn early the joys of human relationships, of being with people they love, and also the pain when those people seem to be abandoning them. And so in these first 6 hours of the 21 hours, we find Jesus face to face with the fact that the people that he loved the most were abandoning him at a time when he needed them the most. It starts around the dinner table with himself and his 12 disciples. Early in the course of the dinner, Jesus explains that one of them is going to be instrumental in bringing about his demise. Of course, he's talking about Judas Iscariot, and Jesus has been hinting about all week about dying, and now he lowers the boom by saying that Judas is going to make this happen. And so Judas runs out of the room. But you can imagine, how awkward that moment must have been. Maybe as a means of breaking the awkwardness, Peter opens up his mouth, his big mouth. And that's a great way to think of Peter, because he didn't seem to always have a filter. He just kind of said the first thing that was on his mind, always. And he looks at Jesus and he says, "That will never happen to me, Lord." And Jesus says, "Oh yeah? I predict it will happen 3 times before tomorrow morning, before the rooster crows." As you know, that's exactly what happened a little bit later in the night and early in the morning. And the third denial, after that third denial, I believe that we have one of the most emotional verses in all of the Bible. Look at Luke 22:61. It says, "The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter." How would that have made you feel if you were Peter? Really? After dinner, Jesus heads outside to a large garden called Gethsemane, where he will pray for a few hours. And none of us know if we will be given a notice that death will come to us in a matter of a few hours, but Jesus did. But if we have our wits about us, you know what? I hope that I would do what he did, and I would spend that time praying. Luke is one of the four gospel writers, and he's the only one who included the physical phenomenon about this prayer. Look at Luke 24:44. It says, "And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground." This is a real medical condition called hematidrosis, where under extreme stress, capillaries under the skin literally break and bleed through the pores. That's how intense this prayer of Jesus was before he died. But here's what I want you to see. Jesus had taken his best friends to the garden, Peter, James, and John. And if you know the story, you know they fell asleep while Jesus was praying. And Jesus kind of seemed a little surprised by it. You know, I'm over here praying my guts out, you guys, and you can't stay awake. And so one of the prime things that stand out during this time, this first time segment, is that Jesus is abandoned and he's let down by the people who knew him the most. Has that ever happened to you? Anybody you love ever turn their back on you, stab you in the back maybe, or walk away from you when you needed them the most? You know, if you've ever been in that setting, make sure that you see now how Jesus responded to these settings. Think about it. He went ahead and he shared the food with Judas, who would sell him for just some change, 30 pieces of silver. After his resurrection, he asked Peter. After his denial, he reinstated him, and he used him to start his church, in Acts chapter 2 tells us. And before he ascended back into heaven, John wrote that Jesus still considered John the disciple he loved the most. So when abandoned, think about it, Jesus was graceful. Let that stick with you. And the next time that you feel left behind or feel abandoned. The second segment of that we want to look at here is that period between Friday midnight and 3 a.m., the arrest of Jesus. Somewhere towards the end of that intense prayer time, Jesus is interrupted by a mob. The Jewish religious leaders had recruited a large group of thugs with swords and clubs to go find Jesus and bind him up and to bring him back to them. And it's hard to tell how long this all lasted, but there is so much commotion involved that it probably wasn't as immediate a capture as we've maybe seen on Live PD, if you've ever watched that program. So we're just kind of estimating the 3-hour time period here. And there are a number of things that the Bible tells us about this time frame that are worthy to know. Apparently Peter, the disciple who couldn't always control his tongue, might have also been one of those who enjoyed a good tussle now and then, because he drew out his sword and he cut off the ear of one of this mob that came to arrest Jesus. His name was Malchus. And Jesus wasn't too happy with that response, and so he healed the man's ear. Dr. Luke recorded this incident, so he's the one who notices this action of Jesus, and we don't have a lot of details about that, so we're kind of left to our own sanctified imaginations here. Did Jesus bend down maybe and pick the ear up and put it on the head of Malchus and say, "Hey, sorry about that, brother. He's the hothead of this group sometimes," referring to Peter? Is that what maybe happened? I don't know. But here's what we do know. We never see Malchus come up in the Bible again. What? How do you have God do an amazing work in your life and then keep quiet about it? Just go about your life as if nothing happened. But have you ever done that? Has God ever done an amazing thing in your life? And you just went on about life and nothing changes? Has he ever worked a healing maybe in a relationship, or a healing of an illness, or getting you past an addiction, or getting you a job? When God does the amazing in your life, make sure that you are never the same, and don't forget it. But here's the thing that stands out to me about this second segment. Jesus knows what's going to happen in the next two segments. He knows about the trials that are just ahead of him. He knows about the crucifixion that's coming and the pain that's involved with that. But he willingly walks into that. And you can see a couple hints about it. Look at this verse from John 18:2. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. And so Judas is going to lead this mob of thugs to Jesus, and he knows where Jesus is because Jesus always goes there. Don't you think that Jesus could have or would have chosen to go to a place where they wouldn't be able to find him? I sometimes laugh when I'm watching the news and you see how dumb criminals are sometimes, how dumb they are. And like Jim Bob robbed the convenience store and the police found him at his home 30 minutes later. That's all. I want to yell, why did you go home, Jim Bob? Why didn't you go hide in the woods or do something like that? Why? The reason Jesus went to this place is not because he was dumb, but because he wanted them to find him. He was a willing participant in what was about to happen. It was a part of the plan. And so this is exactly what happens. Here's the greater truth of all in this. Jesus was the innocent person here. The disciples were the guilty. The mob was the guilty. But the innocent, Jesus willingly took the heat. He said, let the guilty go. Don't ever forget that. All that Jesus did on Good Friday, he did willingly because he loved us that much. Okay, let's look at the third segment from 3 a.m. on Friday morning to the 9 a.m. where Jesus begins to experience the trials. And if you love Jesus, I have often felt that it was really a good idea to understand the process of the trials that Jesus went through where they falsely found him guilty so that they could crucify him. And so I want to diagram this out for you in case you have never seen it so that you have a really good idea of what happened. Jesus actually went through two separate systems of trials. A religious system controlled by the Jews and a civil system controlled by the Romans. The Jews did not have the authority to put someone to death, and that's why they needed the Roman civil system to complete their task. So let's start with the religious trial. The Jews were ruled by a leadership called the Sanhedrin. It was 70 men who governed their religion. The chairman of that council was called the high priest. And so the mob takes Jesus from the garden where they found him, and they took him to the home of Annas. Now, don't lose sight of the fact that this is in the middle of the night. And this shows the rush of trying to get this done quickly. But there is an interesting caveat here. Annas was not the high priest that year. He was the high priest the year before, but apparently some people still saw him as the power broker, and so they went there first. And this is the first time that we find Jesus being roughed up a little. And Annas was apparently a wise man because he said that this needs to go through the proper channels. And so Annas sends him to the current high priest, who is a man named Caiaphas. And now we're probably still late into the middle of the night, and an amazing thing happens. Caiaphas has called an emergency meeting of the council, all 70 of them. And they are gathered at his home. Now, I've had meetings in my home with elders and staff before, and my wife gets things ready oh, does she get things ready? But I've never shook her in bed in the middle of the night and said, Amy, honey, get up. The elders are coming over for a few minutes, and we need some cookies. I've never done that. And she wouldn't appreciate that either. If you ever read about this trial, you know that they have been looking for witnesses all along who would just kind of make some stuff up about Jesus so that they could find a charge that would stick. Jesus is roughed up some more, slapped around, spit upon, and now let that just lean on you for a second. We're talking about a religious group of men here who are using physical force to get their point across. You know, we in America have a disgust about that when we hear of things like the radical Islam, what radical Islam does, but this is the same sentiment here. In the name of religion, to use physical brutality. And so the religious council finds him guilty, and now they have to move this to a civil system in order to put him to death. And so it's probably nearing daybreak now, and they take him to the home of Pilate. Pilate is the governor of the region called Judea, which is part of the Roman Empire. And so you have Caesar as the head of the Roman Empire, and he appoints all his governors of the regions, and Pilate is one of them. The Jews changed the charges here against Jesus. Basically, they distort the truth to support their cause. And Pilate couldn't care about their religious laws. And so he told them that Jesus claimed to be a king and would probably rise up and confront the Roman Empire. And so Pilate questions Jesus, and he finds out that he is from Galilee, not Judea. And wouldn't you know it, the governor of Galilee happens to be in town. His name is Herod, and he's staying over at the Holiday Inn on Jerusalem Boulevard. And so Pilate ships him over to Herod. Now, there's an interesting background story here. Herod was fooling around with his sister-in-law, and not that long ago, John the Baptist called him out on it. And so Herod does away with John the Baptist. He beheads him, literally. Now, Jesus and John the Baptist were cousins, and so they're close. They are close. And so Jesus is facing the man who killed his cousin. Yeah, here's an interesting thing to know. It's the only time in all of this 21-hour period where Jesus was silent. You know, he talked to the mob. He talked to Annas. He talked to Caiaphas. He talked to Pilate. But when Herod questioned him, he did not open his mouth. Maybe when you're about to explode on someone who has done you great harm, perhaps the best thing that you can do is just to be silent. Your silence will get your point across. And so Herod and his group roughs him up again, and he sends him back to Pilate. Now, Jesus is at the home of Pilate for the second time. The bottom line here is that Pilate didn't believe that Jesus did anything wrong, but that he was also trying to satisfy the Jews. And so Pilate did a couple things to calm the Jews down. First, he offered to release a prisoner to them. They could choose Jesus or Barabbas, a known murderer. And they chose Barabbas. Now, how do you think that made Jesus feel? Having people say they would rather have a murderer on the streets than him to be released. Secondly, Pilate had Jesus flogged. Now, I've purposely chosen not to describe that for you today. You can research that on your own if you're interested, and you can see the horror of such beating. You can watch the video DVD of The Passion of the Christ. But let me say this about it. The skill of a Roman soldier was to flog a criminal without killing him. Yeah, that would be a talented flogger. And many times the sentence of a criminal was canceled because he didn't make it through the flogging. And so after the flogging, it was amazing that Jesus was even alive, still alive. And so after the flogging, Jesus is brought back a third time to Pilate. And he essentially shows Jesus to the crowd now. And he asks, is this enough? And they're yelling to him, crucify him, crucify him. And finally, Pilate gives up and sends him to be crucified. Which brings us to the fourth segment this morning, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., the last account of Jesus' life here on earth up to his crucifixion. Now, you can see that Jesus was placed on the cross at 9 in the morning and died at 6 hours later at 3 in the afternoon. And what I want you to know about that, was this was a short time to be on the cross. Most of the time, death was much longer. So why did Jesus die so soon? Well, obviously, God was in charge of the timing here, and so that's the specific answer to the question right there. God's in charge. But there are some physical things going on that would have contributed to the early death of Jesus. One of those, obviously, was the condition Jesus was in after his flogging. Without the flogging, you know what? He would have been much stronger and in better physical shape to endure this. But another key reason here is the apparent absence of a sedile, which is a Greek term for a seat. Sometimes the Romans would place a seat jutting out from the cross that the criminal would sit on, but still his hands would be attached to the crossbars. But for Jesus, he didn't have that. Instead, what held him on the physical structure of the cross was the spikes in his wrist and in his feet. Because the sedile was not there, his body would kind of slump, making it very hard to breathe, particularly from the flogging. And the only way to breathe was either to be sitting on a sedile or stand up by putting pressure on the spike on his feet. So most medical professionals who study this sort of thing believe that Jesus died from a combination of blood loss and asphyxiation. What a horrible 21 hours. But as I think through that time period, the most alarming part of it is not any of those four segments, but something that happened about 650 years before this. All of the events of this time period are looked at today were predicted by the Old Testament prophet named Isaiah 650 years earlier. And I hope that you'll take time today to maybe read the entire, or maybe sometime during this week, read the entire chapter of Isaiah 53. But Isaiah 53 verse 4 says, surely he, this is the prophecy, surely he took our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Isaiah 53:5 says, but he was pierced for our transgressions, and he was crushed for our iniquities. You see the emphasis of the word our there? Everything we looked at today that happened to Jesus in 21 hours was really supposed to happen to us because of the sin in our life. But he willingly took it for us. So what are you going to do about that? Now that you know what he went through, what are you going to do about that? In closing, I think about the story of Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who should have, his story should be embedded in the memory of every person who loves Jesus. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker was a B-17 pilot in World War II. And on a particular mission, his plane went down somewhere in the South Pacific, and many of the crew survived by floating on makeshift rafts and for about a month. And they fought off weather, they fought off sharks, they fought off hopelessness, but the greatest battle that they had was starvation. And after 8 days, their rations were gone. And years later, Rickenbacker wrote that on one particular day of tremendous hunger, the crew prayed together and all fell asleep. But Rickenbacker was awakened when something landed on his head. He slowly opened his eyes and he saw his companions with wide eyes. Hundreds of miles from shore, a seagull had landed on his hat. And in one swift move, the captain grabbed the bird, whose body parts would now be used as bait to catch fish that would sustain the crew until they were rescued. Wow. But that's only half of the story. Because if you lived on the eastern shore of Florida, you could walk out on the beach any Friday night where he lived around dusk and all the way up to 1973 when Rickenbacker died, and you would see the captain walking the beach and feeding the seagulls in honor of the one who died for him. You see, when someone gives all they have so that you can have all you have, there's no way that you can get that out of your head. And there's no way that you can have it impact your life. And that's why the 21 hours should change your life and my life forever. He gave his all so that you and I could have a glorious future. So what will you do with this? As we close, and I pray here in just a moment, if you have questions, if this has kind of been your wake-up call of what Jesus did for you, I would welcome a contact from you either on our website or my personal email there on the church's website. Feel free to contact me. Okay? Let's pray.